Now we come to section 9, which I think is beautifully titled. Note the heading of this section: The policy of general price level stabilization and its destabilizing effects on the economy. There are periods in history when, due to the introduction of new technologies, the sharpening of the entrepreneurial spirit, the entrance of increasing numbers of the population into economic circuits, as a combined result of all of these factors, productivity, that is, the production of goods and services, increases dramatically. Such a set of circumstances existed in the 1920s, for instance. Henry Ford introduced a brilliant entrepreneurial innovation: assembly line production. Until then, cars had been made one by one, to order. Now they were mass-produced. Consequently, what happened? Costs fell. Many more cars were produced, and what had been a luxury item reserved for millionaires became a mass consumer good for the working middle class, the Ford Model T. Similar circumstances existed in the last decade of the 20th century and the first few years of the 21st. Such major innovations as the Internet and new communications technologies were adopted. And above all, over 1 billion people who had been outside the market went to work in a market economy in China and in India. This led to an enormous increase in production. Dear students, when these factors are present, there is such a rise in the quantity and quality of goods and services produced that, other things being equal, the price per unit tends to fall. Well, this process in which more is produced at lower and lower prices is the healthiest and most favorable form of economic development, because even if we earn the same amount, what we buy costs us less and less. For example, in the field of technology, I remember the first personal computer I ever purchased, back around 1985, one of the first ones to arrive in Spain. It cost me several million pesetas at the time, which would be like 25,000 euros today. Actually, if we take inflation into account, it would be more like 50,000 euros today. How many personal computers can I buy today with 50,000 euros? 50. And each one of them with at least 100 times more capacity than the one I bought in 1985. What does this mean? It means that due to technological innovations and the increase in productivity, the unit price of this product has not stopped declining. Well, in periods like these, in which productivity rises so much and prices should drop, many economists insist that the purchasing power of the monetary unit must be kept stable. In other words, that we must prevent prices from falling. Thus, in the 1920s, and in the years surrounding the end of the last century and the beginning of the current one, when this huge increase in productivity should have led to a very significant decrease in unit prices, though to a greater or a lesser extent, depending on the good in question, it turns out that under the pretext of keeping the purchasing power of the monetary unit constant, that is, preventing the purchasing power of the monetary unit from increasing as a result of a decrease in prices, authorities reacted by injecting on a massive scale the money necessary to keep prices from falling, to keep them stable. Well, in contexts of mounting productivity, so-called stabilization policies have extremely harmful, destabilizing effects. To begin with, they conceal what is really happening from citizens. In the 1920s, and in recent years before our current crisis, prices did not rise much, and hence politicians and citizens thought a perpetual virtuous cycle had been reached, when in fact the system was undergoing an expansion of credit the likes of which had not been seen for decades. Credit was being injected into the system to offset the marked decrease in prices, which, in the absence of interference, would have followed the increase in productivity. The increase in productivity offered the excuse for injecting inflation with impunity. In other circumstances, with no increase in productivity, the injection of credit expansion could not have been so far-reaching, because its effects would have been noticed sooner. But in such long periods of rising productivity, as I have mentioned, the 1920s and the years surrounding the change of century, an increasing rate of credit expansion was kept up for over a decade, because citizens did not perceive it in the form of a rise in prices. It was specialists alone, those who were aware of the high growth in productivity, who knew that a more or less stable price level could be maintained only at the expense of a huge injection of money. This injection was not noticeable in the form of an increase in the unit prices of consumer goods and services, but it was noticeable in the prices of productive factors, capital goods, and the securities that represent them in the stock market. During the period of irrational exuberance, these prices rose continually. Sensible economists sounded the alarm, but no one listened to us. People said, "Not to worry, what does it matter? Prices are rising on the stock market because things are going very well. Anyway, look at the prices of consumer goods. They are not going up." We told them they should have gone down, and significantly, due to the large increase in productivity. The fact that they are not going up reveals the severe monetary distortion the system is causing. And even if unit prices do not rise, the vigorous and growing credit expansion that has been injected into the system under the pretext of stabilizing the purchasing power of the monetary unit has not failed to have its effect in the form of widespread malinvestments. And in the end, the 6 effects we studied have appeared in the shape of an acute financial crisis and economic recession. Indeed, we have already seen the first effect, growth in the price of the factors of production and raw materials. Remember that the price of oil skyrocketed in 2007 before everything collapsed. What did we say the second effect was? More than proportional growth in the price of consumer goods. We have not observed this effect in this most recent cycle, nor was it observed in the 1920s. However, it has ultimately been replaced by something that is essentially the same thing. Even if prices per unit have not risen, production has increased so much that the sales of consumer goods companies, equal to the unit price times the number of units sold, have gone through the roof, and thus the largest profits have arisen in consumer rather than in capital industries. This is the third effect, which tells entrepreneurs, you have made a mistake. You have invested in the wrong place, and you must move toward consumer companies. There is great demand for labor. The fourth effect, the Ricardo effect, appears. The 6 effects are triggered all the same, and they give rise to a financial crisis and an economic recession that leaves macroeconomists scratching their heads. They cannot understand how such a turn of events could have come about, when we appeared to have entered a never-ending virtuous cycle, the best of worlds, in which there was no inflation. Prices were more or less stable. And what is more, we were getting rich as if by magic, simply by purchasing on the stock market, or buying apartments or real estate, and waiting and watching as our assets went up in value month after month. Notice that economic theory is a toolbox of concepts that enable us to comprehend what we cannot see, which is what matters. A good economist is one who can understand what is invisible, what is not obvious. So our entire theory tallies perfectly with those processes of rising productivity, and policies of stabilizing the purchasing power of the monetary unit are profoundly destabilizing. The same was true in the 1920s, the roaring 20s of the Great Gatsby, when everything was going well. The stock market kept rising. Prices were not going up. People said the same thing, that we had reached a virtuous cycle for a permanently high plateau. And yet the seeds were being sown for an immensely severe financial crisis and recession. Extremely strong similarities exist between this period and the one we have just lived through, and which has ended in the current financial crisis and economic recession. Be sure to read the list of financial crises and economic recessions at the end of the chapter. There is a quick mention of those we have studied from the time of the Greeks and the Middle Ages, but mainly the list focuses on all the financial crises to have hit since the arrival of the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century. And you will see that, surprisingly, they all follow practically the same pattern, or a very similar pattern. Analyze them, because they are laid out for you, paragraph by paragraph. It is very important that you read about them.